Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
We are now going to introduce Wendy Doniger. We'll talk about a whole fascinating range from very old to very recent Hindu cosmogonic devotional and political.
Thank you all. My problem is in some ways the opposite of the problem that I see Dean Mitchell having addressed. So where she was trying to make strange what the incoming student might be assumed to be familiar with. Oh, I know Christianity, I know lots of Christians grew up in America, and that's religion, and I know all about it, and so she was going to say, actually, you don't know what you think you know. I am doing something of the same, but in dealing with a religion that I can assume the students in my class are not familiar with, I see my primary job as disabusing them of the sort of wrong idea that I assume that people who don't study Hinduism have about Hinduism, as I've judged it from the media and from conversations and so forth. So I try to tackle them head on and to say, you thought it was like this, it's not, it's like that. You thought it was like this, it's not, it's like that. So it's making, in some ways, less strange. I mean, I'll tell you something about religion, but also taking away the assumptions. So I've identified five basic assumptions that I think people have about Hinduism coming in, and like all generalizations, they have a little bit of truth, but they're basically all wrong. So the first is that there's a single thing that all Hindus believe. Like Christians have their Bible and Muslims have the Quran, and so what is the book that the Hindus have, and what is the one thing that they all believe? So the first thing I try to do is fragment that. Arthur Atkins, the great Arthur Atkins, always used to say, anyone who begins a sentence with the phrase, the Greeks believed, is talking nonsense. So I hope anyone who comes out of my Hinduism class will never say Hindus believe X and Y. So you knock that out by complexifying it in various ways. The idea that all Hindus believe the same thing and have one book is also a pillar of contemporary Hindu fundamentalism. We're all Hindus who all believe one thing, and it's what I tell you it is, and anyone who tells you that Hinduism is different is ignorant or lying. And I should say that I'm also aware of the contemporary political problems that Hinduism faces, and in studying ancient India, I have that in mind always. It's always about now, in some sense. So that's the first generalization about the sameness of it, that they all have the Gita, and that they all say what the Hindu internet sources say all Hindus believe in is what that is. The second assumption, which is equally wrong and is the opposite, is Hinduism is so different. The forms of Hinduism are so different that there's no there. That there's no such thing as Hinduism at all. The word Hinduism refers to a non-existent entity. You can't say anything about Hinduism because all Hindus are entirely different. And this comes from the fact that Hinduism has neither a pope nor an ulama, and in many ways there are many different forms of Hinduism, which is of course the answer to generalization one. But that's really wrong, because there are shared ideas that you can do a history of Hinduism and you can trace it all through, and you can see that certain things do keep coming back. It's not one book, it's not one doctrine, but there is a cluster, what I call this Venn diagram, this cluster of intersecting beliefs, no one of which is essential, no one of which is known to all Hindus, but will be recognized by most Hindus, some Hindus, at different times in history. So while I'm deconstructing it and tearing it apart, I'm also giving a thread on which you can hang all these different Hinduisms. So that's the second generalization that I tackle, that Hinduism, because it's so various. The third, which is a little more subtle, but it's also widespread, partly because contemporary Hindus have made it widespread, is the idea that Hinduism is enormously tolerant. That anybody can say anything, and we welcome all religions, and the Buddha became an avatar of Vishnu, and Christ became an avatar of Vishnu, and we embrace all these ideas. We believe in non-usury. Gandhi, remember Gandhi? We don't hurt animals, and there's no violence in Hindu. We have Hinduism. We have non-violence. We have ahimsa, and that therefore Hinduism is this all-embracing, tolerant religion, which is again a political statement, but it's also made in very early texts. I kind of blow that up. And the fourth generalization that I think my students come into the classroom with is the idea that Hinduism is colossally intolerant, that they have a caste system which is oppressive in a way that is not like any other oppressive system in the world. Tell us about the caste system. We have nothing like that at home. We want to know how these wicked people mistreat the untouchables, and that's what Hinduism is all about. That is a dominant thread in many high school textbooks of religion to this day, which is one of the reasons that the American Hindu Foundation wanted to change the textbooks. They also wanted to say that there is no caste system and all Hindus believe the same thing. We all read the Gita and we're going to swing together and do a problem. But that, the fourth one, is there, and it is a problem that anyone who teaches about Hinduism has got to tackle pretty much from the start. And then the fifth generalization, which is part of scholarship, but again is part of the contemporary political scene very much, is that Hindus have always mistreated women. It's particularly important nowadays with these spectacular cases of rape and the suppression of news about rape and so forth. And the impression that I think you would get from the media is that all women in India are constantly in danger of rape, and this has been so always, and that the whole Hindu system is geared against women. And like all of these, there is a problem there, but it is not a unique problem, and it's not the only thing that there is about women in India, and it has to be addressed, and I think it has to be faced and brought out that it is something that may be in the heads of the students in my classroom, and that it is not true. It has something to talk about in it. It's a talking point, all right. There's a reason why there is a widespread belief that it is so, but it is not true, and therefore you have to sort of go at it. So that's what I see as my agenda for a course on Hinduism for incoming students who know nothing about Hinduism. To some extent, I could take a page from Professor Mitchell's book and say these are not problems unique to Hinduism. That is to say, we tend to think of religions, especially other people's religions, in these generalizations. And the only way to get away from that is by taking a closer look at what the texts say. So my source, in a sense, I think source in two senses, both the particular text source, I'll have some text, but I also have a source book, which I made all by myself, in order that I could have it in the classroom. And it's the New Northern Anthology of World Religions, which I put together precisely to address all the issues that I have just mentioned, all of them. So on the one hand, it is a 700-page book that goes from the Rig Veda to the present, and there's a lot of different things in it. You couldn't look through it and go away saying, oh, all Hindus believe just one thing. At the second time, it is heavily cross-referenced to show you that we keep coming back to some of the same things. The modern things are quoting the Mahabharata. The texts that come to terms with Islam are also quoting the texts that have come to terms with Christianity, that there's a way that Hindus deal with others right along the way. And so you can see that there's a there, that there's something going on which is a thread And so the later texts constantly refer back to the early text, so you get a sense of intertextuality, a sense of a conversation going on between very often very different points of view, but then you can get something out of the intertextuality. I also begin, and we'll talk about this first text, I begin with the open-mindedness of the Hindu tradition, and give a spectacular text for that. I close in the modern period with a rabidly anti-Muslim piece, which demonstrates the other side of Hinduism. The open-minded text is from 1500 BCE, and the closed-minded text is from last week, practically. I could have taken a little quote from Modi, but the book went to press before he was elected, so I had to settle with something written actually in the late 20th century. So both of those poles are addressed, and of course, throughout the book, I've highlighted texts that, on the one hand, demonize women, and there are enough of them to make you understand where that canard comes from, that accusation, and at the same time show how there are texts written by women, important texts, and texts about women in a positive way as well. So it's a matter of balancing constantly I recognize that, that's familiar to me, and this is so extraordinary, there's nothing like this in any religion I ever thought before, impulses, and balancing wow, this is so different from that, how can they call it the same religion, with, I see, we're coming about to that again and again. So in a way, the opening lecture can really just blow it up, and in some ways confuse and say, well, we're going to do this, on the other hand we're going to do that, and this on the other hand that, and really I need the full 10 weeks to put it back together again so that you really get a sense of the continuity and so forth. That's why it's a 700-page book, that's why it's a 10-week course. So that's the agenda. I should say that teaching it this way means that I'm losing, in this particular approach, that I'm losing two things which I try to introduce from time to time, but they get short shrift. And in our discussion, I'd like some help to see whether I can mend these flaws better. The first is there's very little ritual. These are stories and philosophical texts. There are some texts which describe rituals, and that's one way you can talk about rituals. And you can contextualize, and then the other part is this very little context, that this is not unlike my book, The Hindus, where I kept trying to tie the text to what was going on. There's an introduction, there are head notes, but there's not enough really to contextualize it. And the question is, are there other ways that I can supplement the class discussions with more of a sense of historical progress, what's going on, and more of a sense of the rituals that accompany the text. So I have to kind of supply that informally. The formal structure of the course is texts, and ritual and context get shorter shrift, although I think they get some shrift. I'd like to have a little more shrift. So let me show you how that I'll do it, and I guess like Margaret, I can sort of treat you as the class at this point. Although, mind you, what I've said to you now is also something I say to the class. I say, this is my agenda. These are the problems I think we have in dealing with any other religion, and the one I know is Hinduism, and that's all I'll talk about. So it's dealing with the whole question of otherness, the way you develop misconceptions about other people's religions and how you get over them, because the best way to get over them is to get to know someone of that religion. But the second best way to get over them is to study the religion, and so I'm trying to do that. So I tell them about the same and the difference and so forth, and women and caste and so forth. So the very first lecture then just is the smorgasbord. It's sort of, this is the range of what we're going to do, and as the class progresses, we spend a week on the Rig Veda, we spend a week on the Upanishads and so forth. But the blasting open the head lecture of that first class, you must understand that what you thought you knew, you don't know. necessarily goes over an enormous range. So let me do it. So the first text I always like to begin with is on page 90 of the Norton Anthology, is the text that's dated 10/129. I think it's probably the second. It says creation came. It's introduced briefly on page 89. And then I have to tell you what this is. So this is a text from the Rig Veda, which was composed, we don't know exactly when, probably around 1500 BCE. Could be earlier or later. It was preserved orally. We have no manuscripts for this until much, much, much later. The text of over 1,000 hymns, each hymn about as long as this one. Lots of words, and it was memorized, I would say letter perfect, except it wasn't written down. Syllable perfect. It was memorized syllable perfect for millennia, even when the ancient Indians had writing, which they used for I owe you, $2, and here I've just sold you 3 cows kind of writing. That's what they used writing for. But this was kept in the head and was kept in the family. And you couldn't take it down from the shelf to learn it. You had to learn it from probably your father. We're talking about men only in this period, learning this text. So it's internalized, and it was, and it remains a kind of a sacred text. Parts of it are known to this day in India, quoted. This particular hymn is a famous one. The next one I'm going to do is even more famous. Other parts of it are not known at all. They're only known to a few scholars. Some of them are not even understood. There are many hapax legomena that nobody really knows how to translate and so forth. So as a sacred object, the Rig Veda remains very important, and some of it remains important as an intellectual source of ideas that remain in new ways. So it's the basis in some ways of all later Hinduism. There are people who believe that it's so different from later Hinduism that it deserves a different name, Vedism, as a separate religion before Hinduism begins. And I think we're talking, if the people in the streets of Delhi today know this hymn, then it's Hinduism. It's a connected tradition. I don't find it useful intellectually, but it's just an arbitrary decision to say that this is pre-Hinduism, this is not the method. So if you look at the hymn, 10/129, it's a famous hymn that's called the Nasadiya hymn, the It Was Not hymn. Na Asat, Indo-European word both of them. Na is not, and Sat is existence, as in Asti, Est. We're talking with an Indo-European language here, Sanskrit related to Greek and Latin. It begins, there was neither non-existence nor existence then. And I personally find it impossible to imagine that. I can imagine existence, and I can imagine non-existence. But I cannot get my head around neither existence nor non-existence. So right from the start, I'm flummoxed. I'm off balance. And if this is the kind of hymn that says, I will now tell you the meaning of life. In the beginning, God created the world in 7 days, and I know exactly what it was and how you listen to me. We're in trouble here, because you can't even understand, really. The Sanskrit is very simple. Na, sat, na, asat, there's no question about translation. You can do it if you have one week of Sanskrit. But the thought is impossible. There was neither non-existence nor existence. There was neither space nor the sky. And it has other questions. There was neither death nor immortality. There was no distinguishing sign. So in all creation hymns, right, you make things different. There was no differentiation here. Everything was all messed up. Darkness was hidden by darkness. All this was water. Now we begin to get something we can deal with. What do we know about? We know water from other creation hymns. We know it often begins with water, and it goes on until we get to the penultimate verse. This is in verse. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? The gods came afterwards with the creation of this universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? Let me stop there for a minute. That's a remarkably non-theological statement, anti-theological statement, right? It says the gods whom we worship, this is a polytheistic religion. There are many gods in the Rig Veda whom we worship, Vishnu and Varuna and Agni and Indra and all these gods. We acknowledge that there are gods, but we don't acknowledge that they can answer these questions for us. And in fact, we don't acknowledge that anyone can answer these questions for us. The gods can't do it. Who then knows, in the last verse, whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. Yeah, well, it makes a difference, doesn't it? Okay. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows. How we say, now we're on good, strong theological. There is some guy in the, or perhaps he does not know. So they throw you a bone and then they take it away. And they say, wouldn't you like to think that there is some guy up there who will tell you, no, you can't have that either. So it is a spectacularly skeptical hymn. It acknowledges that we want to ask this question. Ray Destin and I are teaching a course this quarter, a seminar, comparing religious and scientific ways of dealing with origins, the origin of the universe, the origin of the human race, and so forth, in different ways. And one thing is quite clear is that those questions never go away. Scientists keep asking them, and people of all religious traditions keep asking them. It's a question that keeps coming up. How did it all begin? And some religions say, I will tell you how it all began, and this one doesn't. This text doesn't. This period of Indian religion poses the question invariably and says, we can't tell you the answer. Now, this one hymn doesn't. There are other hymns in the same collection of hymns, the Rig Veda, that say, I'll tell you how creation began. And that's one of the great advantages of polytheism, which is, you can shop in this shop, you can shop in that shop. So this guy who got connected into a scribal tradition so that we have it, gives you the beginning of a skeptical tradition which remains in India. Navanja had to teach a class. He's the person who knows more about this than I do. It goes on well through the Vedic tradition. The bases of knowledge, how you know, you have perception and inference, scripture, smart people tell it to you, and so forth. There are different ways, and the skeptical tradition of India says none of them is worth anything at all. You can't trust your eyes, they figure that out. So much earlier than we did. Testifying in police court, forget it. You cannot trust what people say they see with their own eyes, and so forth and so on. So the skeptical tradition stays on, and so do other traditions in which they say, we have a God, the God made the world, let me tell you, this is exactly how it happened. So this is not even the only view. This is just one view, which is the most open-minded view of all. I'd like to look at a second very important Vedic hymn, which is the other kind of hymn in a way. There's a long introduction, and I guess in a real class, and I had more time, I would introduce it a little bit more. But I will just say this for now, that it's also an old myth, this myth of the dismemberment of a cosmic giant to make the world. It's in particular a very old Indo-European myth, which is to say that there are variants of it in the Norse mythology, there are variants of it in Greek mythology. It's fairly widespread within the Indo-European world. Bruce Leakin has written one of his earliest books. He deals with this in the Indo-European context. So it's a well-known story. You chop up some divine giant to make the world. And that's what this creation myth is about. But in this one, it makes the four social classes. So then this is a very different kind of a myth. First of all, it tells you we know how it was. There's no doubt here. There's nobody knows. This hymn says, I know, I will tell you. And what it tells you is that the four classes which become the basis of the social system, the basis ultimately of the caste system. This is not the caste system yet. This is just common or garden variety class system, very much like the three estates in French theory. So it begins with this Purusha, and the Purusha is the man. It's the word Purusha means a male animal, really. It's the word for you have to have a male animal to sacrifice rather than a female. So it's a very strongly gender-marked word. It's less species-marked, but it comes to mean a human male. But it could also mean another kind of a male. So that's all we know about this creature. We don't know whether he's divine or human or anything. We find out gradually. So it's the Purusha. So the man has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet. He pervaded the earth on all sides and extended beyond it as far as 10 fingers. So this is not a human man. It's a divine creature with many heads and many eyes, and also he pervades everything. Later on in Indian philosophy, we'll get monism and the idea that there's a divine force, ultimate reality, people once called it, some divine essence that pervades everything in the world. Everything is made of God, in a sense. This is not there yet, but you can see where there's going to be a link here. This is the beginning of what will become that. He is whatever has been, whatever is to be, so now we're having recognizable theological language here. Whatever was, whatever will be. The ruler of immortality, he's great, and so forth. And finally they start chopping him up. They anointed him, and about halfway down, when they divided the man, really 3/4 way down, into how many parts did they apportion him? What do they call his mouth, his arms, and thighs, and feet? His mouth became the Brahmin, which is the highest of the four classes in India, the class from which priests are born. That is, all priests must be Brahmins, but not all Brahmins are priests. His arms were made into the king, the second class. His thighs, the people. And from his feet, the servants were born. So, in a way, we have a quartet, but earlier you have language of 3 and 4. If you look into the 4th verse, with 3/4 he rose upwards, and 1/4 of him still remains here. So when you get later Indian social theory, but servants are not really part of the social world. It's a tripartite social world, just as Doniger showed us the Indo-European world in general, namely the king, the priest, the king, and the people. And the servants are of it, but not of it. And so you begin to get that important dichotomy which will later result in the concept of untouchability. People who are not really people. And the outline of that comes even from this early hymn already. Thus they set simple words in order. Now, this is a complex text. There's other things going on here. It is actually a text about sacrifice. And there's a lot about the sacrifice. You sacrifice to the sacrifice with the sacrifice. He sacrifices to himself with himself because there's nothing else there in the early sacrifice. So there's a whole other set of things you can say about this. It's a complex story. We can talk about sacrifice if you like. But the point I just want to bring out from this reading this morning is that it is different in tone from the other one. It is I will tell you instead of I don't know. And it is dealing with a much later period of creation in a sense, not just sort of the beginning, the ab nihilo problem of all creation, but it is dealing with the establishment of a social system. And this hymn is one of the ones which is always quoted in later Hinduism. This remains a part of Hindu religious and social theory right straight on. It's quoted in the law books. It's used later on to justify the caste system. This is the way the world is. We aren't all the same. Some people come from the head, some from the chest, and some from the belly, in a sense, and then some from the feet. So 1500 BC, you're already setting up social dichotomies, which are sanctified by religion, which are made by whatever gods there are, and in particular are created through a sacrifice, which is the holiest way to create anything. So you can't change it. You can't argue with it. It's there. The gods made it. So that's the introduction to Indian religion. There's a sense in which the Veda is the sacred text of Hindus. They certainly both say it is. And there are parts of it that remain known. There are parts which not so much quoted, but are all part of later philosophy. You need the Rig Veda in the morning when you pray to the sun as it rises. Tat Sabator Varanyam, everybody knows that. There are parts of the Rig Veda, 3 or 4 hymns, which have the function of the Lord's Prayer. In fact, the Lord's Prayer in Latin in the old days, where that might be the only prayer you knew in Latin, but that's the one that everybody would know. So there were 1 or 2 bits of the Rig Veda that are like that. You need the Rig Veda at your marriage ceremony. You need it at your funeral ceremony. But it's not the text you use in your religious life if you're a Hindu at almost any period after, about the modern period for me, like 500 BC. There are other texts that Hindus use when they think religious thoughts. They use the Upanishads, which come 1,000 years later after the Rig Veda, that were so important in European philosophy as well. They use the Gita sometimes, but mostly they use texts that aren't in Sanskrit at all, that come from the whole history of India, in Bengal, in Tamil Nadu, and so forth. Those are the worship texts, and I want to look at some of those. So the Rig Veda is there. It's important in a way. It's important as a physical object. You have to have the book there. Originally, it was only oral. Eventually, it was written down, and then became accessible as a book, although its very nature is oral in some ways. But other people invented other texts, and they developed in a number of different ways and a number of different languages. And I want to skip, so I have until 11. I want to skip fast to the 12th century and to Mahadevi Akka, who is a Veera Shaiva woman poet saint, and this is I don't know what page is it on, 358 of the Northern Empire. So the first thing to acknowledge is that she's not writing in Sanskrit. She is composing orally again in Telugu. She's Kannada. She wrote she spoke in Telugu and in Kannada, South Indian languages. These poems are in Kannada. She's a woman. There are women in India. There are women who compose texts that people remember. And in order to do that, she has to break out of the normal social role of women. So you don't have housewives composing poems that are remembered and written down. You have saints, women who give up their lives for religion, and those are the ones that we know about. And this is one who was remembered, her poems were written down later. She regarded herself as married to the god Shiva. She had a husband whom she left, and I'd like to look at the husband inside poem, which starts on page 358 at the bottom of the page. It's introduced on page 358, and the poem is on 359. Husband inside, lover outside, I can't manage them both. This world and that other cannot manage them both. O Lord, white as jasmine, I cannot hold in one hand both the round nuts and the long bow. So, she's speaking of 2 worlds. She's speaking of 2 social systems. Officially, metaphorically, she is speaking of adultery. And the metaphor of adultery becomes very important throughout the medieval religion of what is called bhakti, which is passionate love for a God who loves you back and who's imagined as your lover, which means not a husband whom you're married to and everything is nice and it's all arranged by the parents, but someone that makes you ruin your life. You leave everything. You are socially castigated. You lose your children. You lose, think Anna Karenina, right? You lose everything. You give up everything for this person you love, and it's God. So there is no way condoning adultery. It is purely metaphorical, but it is a really dominant metaphor throughout this medieval and then post-medieval religion. For men as well as women, it becomes a metaphor. So men imagine them as lovers of the god Krishna, as women lovers of the god Krishna, and then of course women also imagine themselves as women lovers of the god Krishna, or in this case, the god Shiva. So we're told, it's a hagiography, but we're told that she actually did leave her husband in order to wander around singing these songs, but her only lover was the god. So she's taking on the social opprobrium of real adultery, sleeping with some guy who's not your husband, but she's taking it on in the service of the god, and she wrote a number of poems. The Lord White as Jasmine is one of the ways of describing the god Shiva in this part of the country that identifies it as a Kannada poem, a poem in the Kannada language. And she talks about the contrast between them. So we could say much more about that religion, which becomes important in Bengal. It's another major way of being a Hindu, to embrace the poetry without leaving your own husband. You can still stay home and do it, but your mindset is that of this passionate love for a God who makes you break all social rules. And then, of course, people in India did break other rules. They wandered around naked. They ate out of a human skull. They did all sorts of things to show that they were not playing by the rules. The last piece, which I'll just refer to a little bit, is an example of modern Hinduism, of one of the trends of modern contemporary Hinduism, both in the American diaspora and in India. In fact, it is most powerful in the American diaspora and only spreading from here to India in many instances. And the money is spreading from here to India, which is a form of Hindu fundamentalism, which is anti-Muslim, anti-woman, anti a lot of its own Hinduism, which is one of the characteristics of fundamentalism. And this is an example of a movement of which the more, this is a silly piece. To say that the Taj Mahal was really a Hindu temple this is not an ancient piece. I mean, this is modern stuff. I think about the 16th century. We have records, right? People had architectural plans in these days. We're not talking about the creation of the world or where the Veda was or anything like that, where the Indo-European people came from. We're talking about a fairly modern building, which everybody saw and saw being built, and we know who paid for it. And nevertheless, we have this. No, it really was a Hindu palace. And if you go down inside the bottom of the Taj Mahal, you'll find Shiva lingams, which are symbols of the god Shiva. It's just totally fantastic, and therefore it's a very silly story. And indeed, all arches, the Muslim arches, that was invented by Hindus. The whole Indo-Muslim architectural style was really originally for Hindus, and Muslims did nothing and so forth. So it's a rabid anti-Muslim piece, but the argument that what people thought was a great Muslim monument, namely the Babri Masjid in Delhi, one of the oldest and most beautiful mosques in Ayodhya, in India, but one that underneath that mosque there actually was a temple to the Hindu god Rama, resulted in riots in which Hindus tore down the mosque and destroyed it entirely while the police looked on, and thousands of people got killed. First of all Muslims, and then Hindus, and then Muslims again. It triggered one of the major political riots in recent Indian history. So it's a funny thing, it's a silly thing, but it's real, and it can be very ugly and very destructive. At one point I was going to end the book with this, and then we talked about it. Jack Miles, the editor, Norm, do you really want to end with this? I said, no, I really don't want to. And so I added at the very, very end several poems by the great K. Ramanujam, who taught here for many years, which are on a modern poems. He wrote them about his own religious sensibilities. He was, among everything else, he was a pious Hindu, but he was also a great linguist. And he wrote poems. One is about the demoness Pujana, who offered her breast to the infant god Krishna, filled with poison to kill him, and he sucked out her life's breath with the milk, and then she died, and immediately she went to heaven because of her intimate contact with Krishna. That's a myth that we have seen in its own historic moment in the 10th century, earlier in the book. You see, we're still doing that in modern India, and another Narasimha, and finally, a poem to Mahadevi Akka, the woman who wrote the poem that I just read to you, and he imagines her life. So I ended on that note of continuity, positivism. These are wonderful stories that still animate and enchant the lives of real people and so forth, rather than ending on the look what Hinduism has become note, which I rather sourly had originally intended to do. So that's the gallop that I like to take in the opening class.
I want to feel a little time for questions, and I'm going to take the privilege of being chair to ask the first one. Wendy, one of the things that I find is a challenge when you don't have 10 weeks, and when you're teaching some Hinduism as part of an introduction to religious studies. And it's my challenge as I'm reading these, and I think it's also the students' challenge, is human capacity for pattern recognition. I read the Rig Veda creation, and I'm comparing it and contrasting it to the creation stories I know. I read about, I'm not even pronouncing it, and I think about Mary of Egypt, girls with her hair, I think about the erotic mysticism of medieval. How, and the question is how to both deal with that, use it in the classroom, subvert it, I don't know.
I use it as much as I can. This was a bit of a rush job. I mentioned water in other creation myths. Well, I do a lot of that, right? We know this in other ways. And again, you're doing a two-handed job. You say it's like these Christian saints, but they aren't exactly like these Christian saints. So you bring them in, and at the same time you push them away. There's water and there's water. There's a flood myth in India too, but it's a different flood myth. So you say, yes, this is not weird. These are not Martians. These are human beings. There are only, Eliade was right, there are only so many patterns, and we all have them. Yes, there are ties, and at the same time, you can't say you know all about this now if you imagine you're a Christian saint. So you have to push and pull with that too. But yes, I use it all the time.
I have a question about metaphor, because you emphasize the metaphorical adulterate image in that poem, and I guess I was struck in reading Rig Veda 1090, this sort of the mythological imagination, how does one know when to identify something as functioning metaphorically or clear, and how does one know whether it's functioning literally, and I guess I wonder, dealing with this kind of mythological material, how do you negotiate that? Because you were so clear in the one situation, and then the other we didn't actually talk about the figural language in 1090.
Yes, it's a good point. I'm clear about the adultery one because it's a very touchy point with Hindus that their gods don't commit adultery. They're very nervous about it, and it's important not to get that bit right or wrong, as the case may be. I mean, there are tantric groups which do it, but not mostly. So that's where I only know the back of this is a metaphor. How to interpret the other metaphors is very interesting. There are these great and pervasive metaphors. Sacrifice is one of the great metaphors. So battle is a sacrifice. But sacrifice, they went around cutting off the heads of animals. They really did it. And we, in another Eliadic moment, every time we sacrifice an animal, we are replicating the original sacrifice of the cosmic Purusha. So it really happened. They really, really did do a sacrifice, which we replicate in our sacrifices. One of the ways you get ritual into the discussion, that Hindus do sacrifices of various kinds. Nowadays, they sacrifice vegetables, and they cut off the heads of coconuts. But once upon a time, and some still do sacrifice goats. So yes, you have to say that a lot of this is very real in many ways. And in a sense, any metaphor can become real. Most of the Aztecs who actually started crucifying people, we stood and said, we got it, yeah, we know about this. And no, said the Christian missionaries, that's not what we mean, you know. So it's a tricky thing always. So yes, that's a point to bring out more than I did. Thank you.
Two observations and agenda from me, and see if you would agree. I really love the Nasarya, the skeptical Rig Veda 10:129, and it seems to me in terms of introducing religion, and I feel fully responsible for this since I'm a scholar of the Pauline letters, that people think religion equals faith. Mm-hmm. People very broad, students think what religions are it's about faith. And they often, in fact, very lazily, and I think it's a real problem for us as scholars of religion, we should never use the word faith to refer to a religious tradition. Like other faiths. Other faiths. So we should not use the word, in my judgment, for that. It's a very particular Christian emphasis. It's a very particular, indeed, even Protestant emphasis in a particular way of parsing what religion is about. And so what I love about this poem, and it's not at all unusual in the literatures that I know, is that skepticism is fully within the study of religion. Absolutely. And so do you agree with me that students tend to come to a class thinking, I'm going to learn about the Hindu faith.
That's right.
Right? And so we're stabilizing not just their view of Hinduism, but their view of religion in general. And then the second is about this amazing thing about the Taj Mahal, just on page, what's the page number? Anyway, 703. That what's fascinating about this text is, it is a silly story, but it's also, and you said this as well, but it's an argument that's actually adopting the forms and the style of the academic study of religion. Right?
Underneath this building, there was another building.
And look at this, it said, this is the basis of sound historical research, just as the solution to a mathematical problem. So in terms of both epistemology but also forms of argument, in an introduction to religion, how soon do we introduce that the study of religion and the forms of religious self-justification are already imbricated with one another in different ways? And so how do you
think about that? The first thing to say about the contemporary period again is the conflict in the academy between people who want to adopt an Enlightenment model of the study of religion and people who want to adopt a faith model. And in the study of Hinduism, this has become a big political issue. So it's alive and well. So this is not just a theoretical discussion at all. Where how do you study religion, and what is the difference between the language used within the faith and outside the faith, and what do you do when they're using the same sort of language to make very different points? So the dating of texts, right? So you get pious Hindus who insist that the Bhagavad Purana was written in 10 million BCE, right? We're dating texts, right? We can date texts too, Alex. So you have to talk about the form of scholarly argument and the substance of scholarly argument. which is carbon dating and references, quotations, and other texts that we can date and so forth. So it's the veneer of scholarship that's coming in here, and it's not really the principles of scholarship. And that's what I think we have to teach students to differentiate, and also the sources of information, of which, of course, the internet is the first one you have to blast out of the park. And you say, I read this, that someone said, and you have to say, where did you read it? And in the study of Hinduism, you must ask that question.
Just another really interesting case of this, one scholarly debate the last several decades is whether there's any such thing as Hinduism, whether that's a useful category. The word itself is an Arabic word just meaning Indian. And is this entirely a colonial construction, et cetera, et cetera. And there's this movement, much attested on the internet lately, of Dalits, untouchables, especially in southern India, who appropriated that debate and argue that what you're told is Hinduism was created by Brahmins in conversation with British colonialists. And so you have a contemporary scholarly debate showing up very much in a politically charged way in the tradition.
Absolutely. And people saying, I'm a Dalit, this is one of the great books. One of the things I quote in the book is a book called Why I Am Not a Hindu. And I've put him here as a testimony for a Hindu. He's a Dalit, he's an untouchable, who knows a great deal about Hinduism, and who writes from a kind of rather crude Marxist point of view, but very originally rewrites the whole history of Hinduism and as constructed by Brahmins and so forth and so forth. But there is a parody of academic arguments, and you do have to talk about what's the difference.
And could I just push back this, or engage the point a little to say that there are, of course, internal scholarly traditions, right? Internal to Hinduism, in such that the academic study of religion isn't the first place where critical scrutiny of claims takes place. So how to do that in a way that doesn't just say, we moderns actually, we do it right, and they never did, but also to name that there are differences of the assumptions.
Can I ask you, because it's relevant somehow to the general discussion about the skepticism of 10, what you call skepticism, although that's itself a complex modern or Western term. But first of all, it is full of positive statements. There was
darkness,
and then it's very interesting. He doesn't start neither existence nor knowledge. I think one would instinctively start with it. It starts the other way.
It starts with knowledge.
Now that is seriously, that's an interesting claim. I mean, the whole thing is
that there was no non-existence before there was no existence.
That's right. I mean, that's kind of wrong.
It's a right point.
And then there are these positives like desire and poetry. Well, of course, it is all poetry in the sense of a voice speaking.
Yes.
So there's something, but the skepticism thing is interesting because you just think about the problems of faith or we've been talking about. Actually, there's a kind of a nice way of rather slowly and poetically easing out.
To tell us that we can tell you something.
Yes, we can. Although we can't tell you anything because God denies this. And anyway, how can we? And they don't deny knowledge, but we can't know, and you can't know who knows, and the authority of knowledge we can know. There's something very interesting about the way it fails to deny itself in the process of endless denial.
And it does give you some. It's the opening. It's the very, very beginning that we don't know, but afterwards we know quite a bit. And the word for poet, I think there's a footnote there. Yes. So it's a kavi, and a poet is both someone who makes special kinds of language, but it's also someone who hears the voice of the gods. Absolutely. So it means that you can't just sort of study poetry and do it. You have to be the kind of person who hears the gods speak. So it's both language and religion in a sense, that is to say communication with the gods. That's one way to define religion at this point. So they are beginning so the poets begin to find these things. And desire, again, is just sort of the beginning of the creation. So you're right, Jess, that you actually get quite a lot of information. I will tell you a lot in it. There is a voice of authority, but it begins and ends with modesty. Well, we don't really know these people. We do know there was water and there was darkness. Yeah, there is information in the hymn. There's also another Vedic hymn, which ends with the repeated refrain, who is the God whom we should worship with the oblation? Who is the God whom we should worship? And then 300 years later, when you get the priest really taking over and saying, we know everything, they say, that's a really important hymn. There's a God named who? Ka. And there's the answer. Indeed, who is the God whom we should answer with the oblation? And they turn the question into an answer. So it's like the exact same hymn.
On that note, we should probably we can take a 7-minute break and be back in a minute.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.